Hi, and welcome back to the Respect Me series of Bullying It's Never Acceptable webinars. This is Module 2, in which we'll be looking at what we mean by bullying, so we'll be looking at our definition of bullying, as well as some scenarios which will help to illustrate that definition. We'll also be looking in a little bit more depth at online bullying and reflecting on prejudice-based bullying. So let's first of all look again at what we mean by bullying. Here is our national definition. Bullying is both behaviour and impact. The impact is on a person's capacity to feel in control of themselves. This is what we term as their sense of agency. Bullying takes place in the context of relationships. It's behaviour that can make people feel hurt, threatened and left out, and it's behaviour that can happen both face-to-face and online. This definition is set out in Respect for All, and it's expected that authorities and young people's organisations will include this definition in their policies, and local schools and subsidiary organisations will also reflect this definition in their policies and practice. Working to an agreed definition is designed to ensure that children and young people receive a consistent approach if they're affected by bullying. This is why it's so important to be aware of and understand the national approach in Scotland. So, let's get into it in more detail now. When we think about what we mean by bullying, it's very useful to think about the following three things. I'm going to ask you now to pause and reflect and note down your thoughts for a minute or two on each of these before continuing on to the next one. So, first of all, does bullying behaviour need to be intentional? Reflect on that for a minute or two and then press play again. Okay, so is intent required for us to characterise it as a bullying incident? No, we don't need to prove intent. Some young people could simply be role modelling behaviour that they've seen elsewhere, and they might be completely unaware of the impact that it's having on someone else. The intent to bully might not be present, but the impact can still happen. Intent is difficult to prove when you're having these conversations with young people about bullying and whether they've used bullying behaviour. And young people can often reframe their behaviour when they're challenged. This means that there's then a loss of focus, where interventions can hinge on establishing whether someone acted deliberately or not, when instead what we could focus on is what they actually did and the impact that it had, rather than thinking about what they intended to do. The second question, does bullying behaviour need to be persistent for it to be characterised as bullying? So pause now and reflect on that for a minute or two. So does the behaviour have to be persistent for it to be recorded as bullying? No. Even though bullying is usually persistent, a single incident can still have a significant impact for some children and young people, as it can begin and sustain a fear of the threat of it happening again. Issues and incidents can take place more than once, but the impact can be significant after just one instance of it happening. Bear in mind, where does persistence begin? How persistence might be viewed by one person, for example, daily, weekly, monthly, might be quite different from the parameters applied by someone else. This leads to inequality and inconsistency of practice, and it's not helpful to wait and see if a pattern emerges before taking action. So we don't think about whether persistence, whether this behaviour has been persistent before we characterise it as bullying. It can be a bullying incident if it's been one incident. And then if you only look at intent and persistence, then what we risk doing is forgetting about impact. An important guiding principle on impact is that bullying is behaviour that makes people feel upset, frightened, and isolated. If you're unsure whether the behaviour is bullying, look at the impact that it's having. And if a young person is unable to regain their sense of agency or control in the situation, then adults should intervene and help restore a young person's sense of agency. By focusing on impact, you reduce the emphasis on the intent and the persistence, and what you do about it is far more important than how you define it. Of course, intent and persistence of incidents are important considerations that will, of course, inform your response, but they should not determine the identification of whether it's bullying or not. So let's have a quick recap now on the definition we have in Scotland of bullying. Okay, just familiarise yourself with that again. Most definitions of bullying use terms such as repeated, deliberate behaviour intended to cause harm. As we've already discussed, the Scottish definition does not use intent or persistence as a part of that definition. The focus is on what the behaviour is that's happening and what impact this behaviour is happening on the young persons involved. Early intervention is key to supporting a child affected by bullying, so we don't wait for patterns of behaviour to emerge before supporting a child. Or we don't wait for patterns of harm to emerge before supporting a child. Sometimes behaviour is labelled as bullying when actually it's not, though. Perhaps it was a disagreement or a difference of opinion. In these situations, we can help young people address these difficulties that naturally arise in relationships, and we can help to support them through these. Again, if we're unsure about whether it's bullying or not, we can ask ourselves and the young person, what was the behaviour? What was the impact? Bullying is a combination of these two things. We can also consider the context of that relationship between the young people. Remember that bullying happens within the context of relationships. So consider the context of each relationship when you're defining a bullying incident. There may be, for example, name-calling behaviour between friends, and if it's trusted friends, maybe there's not been any impact on any young person involved, in which case it's not a bullying incident. But even if there seems to have been no impact on a young person, you might still want to address name-calling, for example, as others could be impacted. You might want to address this behaviour in order to help these young people to establish positive, respectful relationships in the future. Plus, to leave these kinds of behaviours unchallenged can send out a message that these behaviours are acceptable. So remember, when identifying whether an incident is bullying or not, consider the whole definition. What is the context of that relationship between the young people? Has there been an impact on any young person's agency? And do they feel in control of themselves and their own lives? So next we're going to consider 3 scenarios. I'm going to ask you to reflect for a few minutes on each scenario, and then I'll pause the webinar and then you can make some notes before pressing play again to continue. While you're reflecting on these scenarios, consider what was the behaviour, what was the impact, before thinking about whether this is an example of bullying or not. Scenario 1. Lucy was a part of a Snapchat group with friends and some other people she didn't know. After a while, Lucy became the target of nasty comments and people were posting unflattering pictures of her that other people were commenting on. This left Lucy feeling embarrassed, hurt and vulnerable, so she left the group. People kept adding her back to the group and the abuse continues. She doesn't want to block the group because some of her real friends are in it. So pause just now, take a few notes with your thoughts on this. What was the behaviour? What was the impact? And then we'll discuss it after you press play again. Okay, this is an example of bullying online. When we were young, or when I was young, 10 and more years ago, if we were being bullied in school or at a club, we could gain distance from that situation by simply coming away from it, quite often just by going home. But often bullying that happens in person also happens online and vice versa, meaning that young people don't always have the ability to have that safe space to gain that distance from it. The impacts of online bullying are similar to those caused by face-to-face bullying. Online is simply the place, the situation where the behaviour is happening. But even if it's happening through a game or on a social media app like Instagram or Snapchat, online bullying can be just as hurtful and cause similar harmful impacts as face-to-face bullying. Things can be posted that cause humiliation, embarrassment, and leave children feeling helpless, which can therefore affect their sense of agency. Plus, bear in mind that online bullying can spread quickly and escalate easily, so it's important that young people understand how to keep themselves safe and to know what to do if bullying is happening online. Supporting parents and carers with the information they need to ensure their child's safety online is also an important step in minimising the harmful impacts of online bullying. Remember also that a unique feature of online bullying is the way in which behaviour that causes hurt and humiliation towards others can be witnessed thousands, even millions of times if the online content is liked and shared. According to Girls' Attitudes Survey 2018 Girl Guiding, 47% of those who had completed the survey had unkind things said about them on social media. 25% had threatening things said about them on social media. We don't advise that social media access be completely removed from young people. It has positives too, including access to other social groups and support systems. So while a lot of us, our first reaction might be just, block them, just come away from social media, don't use your phone, don't use the internet, that can actually cause more harm than good in some ways. Removing social media access can heighten feelings of social isolation, and it doesn't address the root of the problem. The young person being bullied, if you try to remove their social media access, they might feel like they're the ones that are being punished. It also means we won't be enabling them to build their online resilience and their problem-solving skills. Supporting young people with bullying is about helping them gain control over their lives within safe boundaries, so taking it away can be counterproductive. Plus, if a young person is concerned that they'll have their phone or their internet privileges removed, they'll be less likely to come to you for help. So instead, guide and shape online behaviour. Work with parents to help set boundaries around acceptable and unacceptable behaviour. Help to educate them on the digital skills to keep them safe. So these are things like privacy settings, as well as discussions around about hate crimes. Help them understand that what's not acceptable face-to-face isn't acceptable in online behaviour either. And you might also want to remind a young person that a record of what they've said will be online forever. Employers are likely to check people's social media before employing and sometimes before even interviewing them. Okay, let's have a look at scenario 2 then. Sally and her friends are in S4. Recently, they have started receiving unwanted attention from a group of boys in the year above. When they walk past, the boys make sexist comments and whistle. They've even started lifting some of the girls' skirts. Sally and her friends try to avoid them, and the behaviour makes them feel embarrassed, uncomfortable, and scared. Okay, so reflect now on what was the behaviour, what was the impact, is this an example of bullying or not, and why? So take a few minutes to take some notes on that. Press pause just now, and then we'll come back for discussion when you press play. Okay, scenario 2 then. Some countries use the term sexualised bullying. We don't entertain this concept in Scotland. This is not an example of bullying. It actually goes beyond that. It is sexual harassment, and the lifting of skirts can be considered assault. The intention on the part of the young men might not have been aggressive. Maybe they just thought that they were flirting, but especially now, post the Me Too movement, thankfully there's a much greater awareness of ideas and concepts around consent and what constitutes sexual harassment and sexual assault. So therefore, all young people need to be aware that this is not acceptable behaviour. Okay, slide 24 then. Scenario 3. A young person named Ben starts a new primary school and is known as a boy. After a term, it's agreed in conversation with the school, with teachers and family, that the child's name will change to a girl's name, Zara, and they will be known as a girl. Following this, other children in the school start calling Zara hurtful names, ask her intrusive questions, and leave her out at break times. This behaviour leaves Zara feeling hurt, threatened, and alone. So have a think here. Again, what was the behaviour? What was the impact? Is this an example of bullying? And why or why not? So pause now to take some notes. Okay, scenario 3 is an example of bullying. It's also an example of prejudice-based bullying. What this shows is this idea around about intention. It might not have been this bullying that might not have been intended to cause an impact of Zara feeling hurt and threatened and alone. These questions from other children might just have been the result of innocent confusion about why their friend had a new name and a new sex or gender. There are a lot of positives around this scenario. Zara obviously has supportive parents and a supportive school. Dialogue is happening between Zara's family and school. And there are things in here we don't know. Did Zara want to reduce attention to her transition, for example? In an ideal world, the school could have prevented this bullying situation by educating the other children, but perhaps they didn't out of respect to Zara's wishes. What is clear here is that more education is needed in order to help the other young people understand and in order to help prevent any future prejudice and hurtful comments. We've included this example particularly because young people are now transitioning more commonly, and it's something that many professionals know we still need to address in our own training. Details of where to go for training or for more information are included at the end of these modules and on the respectme website. So let's reflect now on prejudice. Each of us has a completely unique perspective on the world. We're all individuals with an individual set of experiences from childhood, experiences where we grew up, our race, our religion, and our education. We're also all influenced by societal norms and pressures, many of which have been shaped by our culture over a long time and continue to be perpetuated in the media. So it's natural for people to notice difference, something that's different to them or different to a perceived norm. So you could say that we all have inherent prejudices. However, if we act from these prejudices, if we make assumptions or treat people unfavourably, then this can lead to discrimination or prejudice-based bullying. Children and young people can experience bullying because of prejudice against something perceived to be different. This could be where they live, maybe their sexual orientation, their gender, their disability, the colour of the skin, what clothes they wear, or what football team they support. So this focus on prejudice-based bullying is important because Respect for All is explicit in the message that bullying motivated by prejudiced attitudes has no place in Scotland. Focusing on prejudice-based bullying is important as evidence shows that prejudice-based bullying is affecting groups of young people across Scotland, and here are a few examples on the slide. 72% of LGBT young people experience bullying in school on the grounds of being LGBT. 2/3 of young people who have learning disabilities and or autism spectrum disorders have been bullied. And 56% of Scottish pupils said they were aware of pupils in their school who had experienced bullying based on race. So we'll remind you here that while prejudice is a wider social problem, which isn't isolated to schools or children and young people's organisations, these settings do play a hugely valuable role in bringing about social change through education and learning. Let's have a little look here at some examples of prejudice-based bullying, of reasons that a young person might experience bullying based on prejudice. As we look at this list, remember that most individuals experience more than one characteristic at the same time. and as professionals, we need to be mindful of the impact of this. Take a moment to look at this list and ask yourself what prejudices you may have seen in your setting among young people. Because prejudice-based bullying can be motivated by any characteristic unique to a child or young person, there are many groups or characteristics that may experience this. In order to address and challenge prejudice-based bullying, it's important to be able to recognise when it's happening and how it plays out for these different groups. By not challenging prejudice, it again sends the message that prejudice is acceptable and can cause bullying and discrimination to thrive. Due to the history of discrimination against people who have some of these characteristics or who are perceived to have these characteristics, the Equality Act 2010 affords them special protection. The protected characteristics are on the previous slide in bold. You can see those there now. Please note that age and marriage or civil partnership don't apply in schools. The Equality Act 2010 creates a duty on public bodies to have due regard to the need to eliminate discrimination, harassment and victimisation, to advance equality and to foster good relationships between those with protected characteristics and others. So in practical terms, the Act means that schools and other public bodies have an obligation to ensure that bullying by pupils or young people that is related to a particular characteristic is treated with the same level of seriousness than any other form of bullying, and all other relevant policies are assessed against the public sector equality duty. So that's us reached the end of Module 2. What do we mean by bullying? Reflect now for a few minutes on the following questions. What is your understanding of what bullying is and what bullying isn't? And now reflect on prejudice-based bullying. Have a think about what prejudices, again, are most prevalent in your setting. How might these affect some of the young people in your care? And how could you address these within your context? So, thanks again for completing Module 2. We hope that has been useful information for you. In Module 3, we'll be looking at ways to address bullying through having effective anti-bullying policies and prevention strategies. In the meantime, please do take the time to complete the SurveyMonkey evaluation form for Module 2. We really do value your feedback, and we look forward to seeing you again in Module 3. Thanks again.